Here's an example of how to refine a research question. This is the sophomore English version. We have a sophomore social studies version too. So if you're heading towards history, then I've got a different one for you. So this is a pretty classic sophomore research question, sort of at its inception. How does social media impact teen mental health? It's really huge, and it's very hard to actually write a fairly short op-ed piece on this. So there are so many aspects of mental health. You can look at the list here, the big giant exclamation bubbles. So you can see you have a lot. So you're just going to have to choose one. And sometimes doing research really helps you narrow it down. So I'm arbitrarily choosing anxiety. You could have chosen any of those, but I'm choosing anxiety just to sort of see where I can go with this. Now, there's a symbiosis between sort of wondering and investigating, where you have to do a little bit of research in order to better inform your research question, and then you revise your research question and do a little bit more investigating. So one of the questions I have for you is, how would you know that anxiety is actually impacted by social media use? So kind of looking at a few articles, I did a Newsbank research, and they mention in passing a recent study published in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry. Sounds really promising, right? Except I cannot find the actual study, and they give no further indication as to who were the authors of this study. So I kind of gave up on this source and said, forget it, goodbye. This looks really promising. Is social media threaten teens' mental health and well-being? But it's from New York Presbyterian Hospital. It's kind of a blog or a newsletter called Health Manners. It's not research. It's just one psychologist sort of giving their opinion, which can be helpful, but really I'm looking for something kind of measurable. So this is another piece that I found that was, while I was kind of digging around, social media puts pressure on body image and is linked to teen anxiety and eating disorders. This is the whole bit. It's a radio clip, and it sounds great, but it's actually something called Dispatches from Within series, which is literally students. So it's great anecdotal evidence, but it's not necessarily the sort of quantifiable, tangible research that we're looking for at the moment. That is not to say that this isn't a good source later on. So while you're doing this sort of calling for like refinement of your research question, don't throw away sources altogether. This, I think, has great potential for helping out because you want those anecdotal experiences, but it's not going to be what you want. The other thing that you have to be mindful of is be very careful about causation versus correlation. So especially with anecdotal evidence, saying, because I use social media and I am depressed doesn't mean that the social media is creating the depression. It could be that you have the depression and that social media is exacerbating it, or that because you're depressing, you're using lots of social media. So you have to be very careful about making assumptions there. I did find this article. So it's 3 psychology professors who are interviewed about research that they've done. So this is actual research. And one of the things I like about it talks about the study is important because it's a scientific advance, because it uses an experiment and it shows that not getting enough likes actually causes adolescents to reduce their feelings of self-worth. That's from one of the authors of one study. A second study says receiving insufficient likes were also more likely to experience symptoms of depression and higher sensitivity to daily stressors. And then students who were victimized by their peers had the most negative reaction to receiving fewer likes. So it's really a scientific experiment that's really focusing on how students are responding to insufficient number of likes, which at least the article provides very tangible numeric evidence that there is a link. So there's absolute link between receiving an insufficient number of likes and students or teens' mental health. So you could revise the question to, how does getting insufficient likes on social media impact teen anxiety? I think you've got some very solid evidence to work from. But one of the things that we're looking for is a complex question. And if we look at that question, it's not really complicated, right? The answer to this is, well, it does, and here are 3 studies that show yes. So how do we actually add some complexity to this question? And I think that one of the things that I found on my travels was this interesting Pew research that shows what parents are most concerned about when their children are using social media. So I thought this was an interesting study because actually they're really worried about explicit content exposure and wasting time, whereas being harassed or experiencing problems of anxiety and depression or experiencing low self-esteem are really at the bottom of the concern list. And I think that is actually a really interesting way to add complexity to this research question. So if we look at this study, we can see that if we look at the alignment between the research and parental concerns as identified by Pew, which is, again, numerical information is really helpful, right? So we can look at this and we're like the things that are very impactful on teens' mental health are actually the least concern, are on the lowest level of concern for the parents. So maybe we could fit this in by saying, to what extent does research about social media's impact on teen anxiety align with parental concerns about social media use? And so now we have a question that is very complex. It is unique, it's very specific, and it really meets the criteria of an effective research question. So one of the things that we end all of these conversations with is let your research be your guide, because you become an expert on this topic, and where your research takes you really helps you refine your question further.